In the summer of 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Yamada sat surrounded by reconnaissance reports at his headquarters, examining intelligence documents with the kind of assurance that comes from years of unchallenged dominance. For more than 2 years, Japanese air forces had controlled the skies above the Pacific, and nothing in these new reports suggested that supremacy would end. His staff officers had compiled detailed performance specifications on an American fighter aircraft that had recently begun arriving at Port Moresby, a machine designated by the Americans as the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. When Yamada studied these specifications closely, he found himself laughing out loud at what appeared to be a monumental design failure by the Americans. The numbers seemed almost absurd. This new fighter had an empty weight of 10,000 pounds, climbing to 17,500 pounds when fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and equipment. The wing-loading figures exceeded anything Japanese aeronautical engineers would consider viable for combat operations in the Pacific theatre. Standing before his assembled squadron commanders, Yamada made his assessment plain. The Americans, he declared, had constructed nothing less than a flying locomotive. His own Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters weighed a mere 3,800 pounds empty. Japanese pilots could complete multiple turning maneuvers in the time this cumbersome Thunderbolt would require to execute a single turn. Everything about the American design violated principles of fighter construction that had been proven effective in combat since the war in China began. Captain Saburo Yamamoto commanded the 11th Sentai and shared his commander's assessment when he examined reconnaissance photographs showing these P-47 aircraft positioned at Port Moresby. The images revealed massive radial engine cowlings, thick wing structures, and bulbous fuselages. Everything about the aircraft's appearance screamed of excessive weight, awkward handling, and poor maneuverability. Yamamoto shook his head in genuine disbelief as he studied the 17,500 pound maximum weight figure. How could the Americans possibly expect to engage Japanese fighters successfully with such a heavy machine? The Ki-43 had already proven itself against Hurricanes, P-40 Warhawks, and even the twin-engined P-38 Lightning fighters. This new monstrosity would surely be even easier prey for Japanese pilots. The calculations supporting Japanese confidence appeared ironclad. The Ki-43 Hayabusa, which American pilots had nicknamed Oscar, possessed extraordinary maneuverability through its innovative butterfly combat flaps. The Mitsubishi Zero had achieved legendary status throughout military aviation circles for its exceptional agility. Intelligence assessments uniformly suggested the P-47 would be completely outmatched in the turning fights that characterized aerial combat throughout the Pacific region. In the violent close-quarter dogfights that erupted over jungle canopies and ocean waves, maneuverability determined which pilots survived and which died. Weight determined maneuverability. The Americans had somehow created the heaviest single-engine fighter aircraft in aviation history. Major Takeo Kato brought veteran perspective to the discussion. With 47 combat missions over China and the Philippines behind him, Kato had perfected techniques for the turning fight, drawing enemy aircraft into low-speed, high-angle engagements where the Ki-43's extraordinary maneuverability guaranteed Japanese victory. He pointed to the technical assessment documents spread before his officers. The P-47 supposedly achieved a maximum speed of 426 miles per hour, but only at 30,000 feet altitude. All combat in the Pacific theatre occurred below 20,000 feet, usually below 15,000. At those operational altitudes, Kato estimated, this tank would achieve perhaps 350 miles per hour. Japanese Ki-43 pilots would dance around such a machine like hawks circling a ponderous condor. Japanese confidence stemmed from more than mere arrogance. Their combat record provided substantial evidence supporting every assumption. From December 7, 1941 onward, Japanese fighter aircraft had swept Allied air forces from Pacific skies with devastating efficiency. The destruction of American air power at Pearl Harbor, the systematic annihilation of British aircraft throughout Malaya, the complete elimination of Dutch aviation in the East Indies, all validated Japanese claims of tactical superiority. Their lightweight, highly maneuverable fighters, flown by superbly trained pilots who had honed their skills through years of combat, seemed genuinely invincible. What Lieutenant Colonel Yamada could not know was that 800 miles south at Port Moresby's Jackson Field, the 348th Fighter Group under Colonel Neil Kirby had been systematically developing revolutionary tactical approaches specifically designed to negate every advantage Japanese pilots believed they possessed. These tactical innovations weren't theoretical exercises dreamed up in training classrooms, but practical solutions born from meticulous analysis of Japanese strengths and corresponding weaknesses. Within 6 months, the aircraft Japanese pilots mocked as a flying tank would be shooting down key 43 fighters at kill ratios that would shatter Japanese confidence in their long-established air superiority doctrine. Within 12 months, surviving Japanese pilots would flee immediately at the mere sight of P-47 formations approaching from high altitude. The fundamental mathematical equation of aerial combat was about to be completely rewritten by 2,000 horsepower engines, 850 caliber machine guns, and tactical approaches that transformed weight into kinetic energy, altitude into potential death, and the derided flying tank into the most feared fighter aircraft operating in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese pilot confidence drew from 3 years of spectacular combat success. Since warfare erupted in China during 1937, Japanese fighter doctrine had evolved around one fundamental principle that seemed unassailable. The aircraft capable of outturning its opponent would win the engagement. This philosophy had been validated repeatedly through combat after combat. Over Chinese territory, Ki-27 Nate fighters had swept Chinese air forces from the sky with contemptuous ease. The Chinese, flying obsolete Russian designs and early American export models, couldn't match the Japanese combination of superior aircraft performance and exceptional pilot skill. When British Commonwealth forces engaged Japanese fighters over Malaya and Burma during 1941 and 1942, their Brewster Buffalo and Hawker Hurricane fighters fell in catastrophic numbers to the nimble Ki-43 aircraft. The massacre proved so complete that Allied commanders ordered their pilots to avoid combat with Japanese fighters whenever possible, representing a humiliating admission of aerial inferiority. Sergeant Satoshi Anabuki, who would ultimately become the highest-scoring Ki-43 ace with 39 confirmed victories, remembered the early days over Burma with perfect clarity. The British Hurricane possessed superior straight-line speed, but once British pilots attempted to turn with Japanese aircraft, they were finished. Japanese pilots could position themselves on an enemy's tail in 2 turns, sometimes less. British pilots had no effective answer to Japanese maneuverability. Japanese fighters would dance gracefully through the sky while their opponents struggled like elephants attempting to waltz. The numbers supported Anabuki's memories emphatically. During the first 4 months of 1942 alone, the 64th Sentai claimed 170 Allied aircraft destroyed while losing only 27 Ki-43 fighters. Such kill ratios seemed to prove the absolute superiority of Japanese design philosophy beyond any reasonable doubt. Lightweight, highly maneuverable fighters flown by intensively trained pilots would always defeat heavier, faster opponents. This wasn't merely a tactical preference. It had achieved the status of religious doctrine within the Japanese Army Air Force. Japanese naval aviators flying the Mitsubishi A6M0 reached identical conclusions through their own combat experiences. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, combat veteran of Pearl Harbor and the devastating Indian Ocean raids, stated during a 1943 tactical briefing that American pilots flew like accountants, following their manuals predictably. They relied on armor protection and overwhelming firepower because they lacked the refined skill required for true aerial combat. When American pilots encountered Japanese fighters, they attempted to dive away to safety. Sometimes they escaped through superior diving speed. When they attempted to fight in turning combat, they always lost. American aircraft, Nakajima maintained, were designed by engineers who had never experienced combat, who had never felt the elegant dance of aerial battle. This wasn't propaganda or wishful thinking designed to maintain morale. Japanese pilots possessed legitimate reasons for their supreme confidence. The Ki-43's combat record was extraordinary by any objective measure. During the conquest of the Netherlands' East Indies, a flight of just 9 Ki-43 fighters engaged 20 Dutch fighters over Java, destroying 11 without sustaining a single loss. Over Rangoon in December 1941, 20 Ki-43 aircraft fought 30 RAF fighters, claiming 18 destroyed for the loss of only 2 Japanese aircraft. These weren't the typical inflated victory claims common to aerial warfare. Allied records largely confirmed the devastating losses their forces had suffered. The evidence seemed overwhelming and incontrovertible. Japanese tactical doctrine was superior to anything Western air forces could offer. The Ki-43 achieved its remarkable maneuverability through obsessive weight reduction and innovative aeronautical design. Its empty weight of just 3,803 pounds resulted from using the thinnest possible aluminum skin, eliminating armour protection entirely, foregoing self-sealing fuel tanks, and mounting minimal armament consisting of 2 7.7mm machine guns, later upgraded to one 7.7mm and one 12.7mm weapon. Every component underwent scrutiny for potential weight savings. Even the pilot's seat was constructed from woven bamboo rather than metal. The butterfly combat flaps, unique to the Ki-43 design, could be deployed at speed to dramatically reduce turning radius, allowing the fighter to reverse direction with almost impossible quickness. These flaps gave the Ki-43 a turning advantage over every Allied fighter in operational service. Captain Yohei Hinoki, who would survive the war with 12 confirmed victories, explained the Ki-43's advantages with precision. Japanese pilots could hang their aircraft on their propellers, nearly motionless, and still maintain control. American fighters would stall and spin if they attempted to match such performance. At low speeds, Japanese fighters were invincible. The key to victory was forcing combat into the Japanese realm, below 200 miles per hour, where weight became a liability rather than an advantage. Japanese pilots called it dancing in the air. The Americans, Hinoki observed, couldn't dance. Japanese pilots had studied American aircraft extensively, analyzing captured examples and interrogating prisoners. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, workhorse of Allied air forces throughout 1942, weighed 6,000 pounds empty and couldn't match the Ki-43's climb rate or turning ability. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, with its unconventional mid-mounted engine placement, had proven so inadequate that American pilots called it the Iron Dog, suggesting it was more dangerous to its own pilots than to the enemy. Even the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and impressive firepower, had fallen regularly to Ki-43 fighters over New Guinea during 1942. The P-38's size and complexity made it vulnerable in the close-quarter combat that Japanese pilots excelled at initiating. Intelligence officer Major Hiroshi Onishi compiled combat reports demonstrating that from December 1941 through June 1943, Ki-43 units claimed 150 Allied aircraft destroyed throughout the Pacific Theatre while losing approximately 130 of their own aircraft. Even accounting for the typical overclaiming inherent in aerial combat reporting, the kill ratios strongly favoured the Japanese approach to fighter design. The evidence seemed conclusive and unambiguous. Lightweight, highly manoeuvrable fighters would always defeat heavier opponents in Pacific Theatre combat. But the P-47 Thunderbolt represented something entirely different, something the Japanese military establishment had not previously encountered and could not initially comprehend. It embodied industrial warfare applied to fighter aviation with ruthless efficiency. Where Japanese designers had pursued perfection through minimalism and weight reduction, Republic Aviation's Alexander Kartveli had pursued dominance through excess and overwhelming capability. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, with later versions generating 2,300 horsepower using water injection. This represented more than double the 980 horsepower produced by the Ki-43's Nakajima Ha-25 engine. This massive power plant required an equally massive airframe, resulting in dimensions that dwarfed every other single-engine fighter aircraft of the war. The P-47's development represented American industrial philosophy perfectly. When the Army Air Corps issued specifications for a new fighter in 1940, Republic Aviation didn't attempt to build the lightest or most maneuverable aircraft possible. Instead, they constructed the most powerful, most heavily armed, most survivable fighter that contemporary technology allowed. The turbo supercharger system alone weighed more than some entire Japanese aircraft engines, but it allowed the P-47 to maintain power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for insufficient air. The first P-47 aircraft arrived in Brisbane, Australia on June 14, 1943, assigned to the 348th Fighter Group commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby. The aircraft had been shipped as deck cargo, partially disassembled, requiring extensive work to make them combat-ready. After assembly and thorough testing at Eagle Farm Airfield, the group began their long flight to Port Moresby, arriving June 23rd. Kirby was not a typical fighter group commander. An analytical thinker who had studied engineering before joining the Army Air Corps, he immediately recognized that traditional dogfighting tactics would be suicide in the P-47. The aircraft's weight and size made it unsuitable for turning combat, but those same characteristics provided advantages that could be systematically exploited. Instead of attempting to turn with Japanese fighters, Kirby would leverage the P-47's genuine strengths: phenomenal dive speed approaching the sound barrier, heavy firepower capable of destroying any target with a brief burst, and the ability to fight effectively above 25,000 feet where Japanese engines struggled for power. The turbo supercharger gave the P-47 a decisive advantage at altitude, maintaining sea-level power up to 25,000 feet, while Japanese fighters lost 50% of their power by 20,000 feet. Technical Sergeant William Anderson, crew chief for the 348th Fighter Group, remembered the first impression vividly. When those jugs rolled off the transport ships, everyone thought somebody had made a terrible mistake. They were enormous, resembling flying boxcars. The propeller alone measured 13 feet in diameter, larger than the entire wingspan of some training aircraft. Pilots who had been flying P-39 and P-40 fighters walked around them shaking their heads in disbelief. How could anyone expect to fight Zeros with something that looked like a flying barn? Some pilots requested transfers immediately. But Kirby possessed a vision that would revolutionize air combat throughout the Pacific. He instituted a rigorous training program that broke every rule of conventional fighter tactics. No more turning fights where individual pilot skill determined the outcome. No more low-altitude furballs where maneuverability mattered most. The P-47 fighters would climb to 30,000 feet, patrol at high altitude using their superb superchargers, then dive on Japanese formations from above at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. At that velocity, the 850 caliber machine guns would unleash 100 rounds per second, each bullet capable of tearing through the Ki-43's unarmored structure like tissue paper. Before Japanese pilots could react, the P-47 fighters would be gone, using their tremendous speed to zoom back to altitude on momentum alone. Captain William Banks, operations officer for the 348th, initially doubted the tactics completely. They had been taught since flight school that fighter combat was about getting on an enemy's tail and staying there until shooting him down. Kirby was instructing them to make one pass and run away. It seemed like cowardice. Then Kirby showed them the mathematics. At 450 miles per hour in a dive, they would be travelling 660 feet per second. A Ki-43 might possess a tighter turning circle, but by the time Japanese pilots started their turn, the P-47 would already be through their formation and climbing back to altitude. Japanese pilots literally couldn't react fast enough to counter such attacks. The training proved intense and revolutionary. Pilots practiced high-altitude formation flying, learning to maintain cohesion in thin air where controls became mushy and engines struggled. They practiced diving attacks, learning to judge the precise moment to open fire for maximum effect while maintaining sufficient speed to escape. They practiced zoom climbs, converting speed back into altitude efficiently. Most importantly, they practiced discipline, resisting the temptation to engage in turning fights where the P-47's weight became a fatal disadvantage. The first major combat test came August 16, 1943, when two squadrons from the 348th encountered Japanese fighters over Tsilitsili airstrip. Following Kirby's tactics precisely, the P-47 fighters climbed to 28,000 feet, while Japanese fighters patrolled at 15,000 feet, completely unaware of the threat above. The Americans positioned themselves up-sun, making visual detection nearly impossible, then rolled into near-vertical dives. The first indication Japanese pilots had of attack was when their wingmen exploded. Flight Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, flying a Ki-43 with the 68th Sentai, survived the encounter and later reported they were flying standard patrol pattern when Suzuki's aircraft simply disintegrated. No warning, no visual contact with the enemy, just sudden destruction. Before they could react, two more aircraft exploded. They scattered, looking desperately for the enemy, but the Americans were already gone, climbing back to altitude at impossible speed. They could only watch as American fighters disappeared into the sun. 3 enemy aircraft were destroyed without loss to the P-47 forces, validating Kirby's revolutionary tactics. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds from first dive to last climb, but its impact would resonate throughout the Japanese Army Air Force. For the first time, Ki-43 pilots had been rendered helpless, unable to bring their superior maneuverability to bear. The real test came September 4, 1943, when Kirby personally led a mission that would demonstrate the P-47's devastating potential. Taking off from Port Moresby with 3 wingmen, Kirby climbed to 31,000 feet, pushing beyond the Ki-43's operational ceiling. Below them, scattered across different altitudes, were Japanese aircraft returning from a mission. Kirby studied the formation carefully, calculating angles, speeds, and escape routes with the precision of an engineer. Then he waggled his wings, signaling attack. The 4 P-47 fighters rolled inverted and pulled through into 70-degree dives. Within seconds, they were passing 400 miles per hour. At 450 miles per hour, Kirby opened fire on a Ki-43 from 1,000 yards, walking his rounds into the target as he closed. The Japanese fighter didn't just catch fire or lose control. It disintegrated under the concentrated impact of 50-caliber rounds, with major components separating in mid-air. Kirby's momentum carried him through the Japanese formation before anyone could react. He pulled up hard, trading speed for altitude, and found himself above the melee again within 20 seconds. Lieutenant Masahiro Ikeda, flying top cover in a Ki-43, witnessed the attack with horror. The enemy came from nowhere, falling like meteors. Tanaka's aircraft exploded before he could call out a warning. The sound of their guns was terrifying, like thunder rolling across the sky. By the time Ikeda turned to engage, the Americans were already climbing away, beyond their reach. They were helpless. On October 11, 1943, the 348th Fighter Group executed the mission that would earn Neil Kirby the Medal of Honor and definitively establish the P-47's dominance over New Guinea. Leading 4 P-47 fighters on a fighter sweep over Wewak, Kirby encountered a massive Japanese formation consisting of 12 bombers escorted by 36 fighters, primarily Ki-43 aircraft with some newer Ki-61 Haiyan fighters mixed in. Traditional fighter doctrine would have called for avoiding such overwhelming odds. Kirby attacked without hesitation. Climbing to 33,000 feet, the 4 P-47 fighters positioned themselves perfectly for a diving attack. The Japanese formation, flying at 18,000 feet, had no idea death was falling from above. Kirby selected a Ki-61 fighter on the formation's edge and began his dive. Accelerating through 475 miles per hour, approaching the aircraft's maximum safe diving speed, he opened fire at 800 yards. The Japanese fighter literally came apart in mid-air, major components separating under the impact of concentrated .50 caliber fire. Kirby's momentum carried him completely through the Japanese formation. Using his tremendous speed, he zoom-climbed back to 25,000 feet and immediately rolled into another attack. This time he targeted a Ki-43 attempting to climb toward him. The lightweight Japanese fighter, struggling to gain altitude, was perfectly positioned in Kirby's gun sight. A 2-second burst sent it spinning down in flames, the pilot unable to escape the mortally wounded aircraft. For the next 8 minutes, Kirby and his wingmen executed continuous boom and zoom attacks on the increasingly disrupted Japanese formation. Kirby personally destroyed 6 enemy aircraft, his wingmen claimed 3 more, and several additional Japanese aircraft were damaged. The bomber formation, completely unprotected after their escorts were destroyed or scattered, fled in disorder. Not one P-47 sustained significant damage despite being outnumbered nearly 12-1. Lieutenant Masashi Ito, flying a Ki-43 in the escort formation, survived the encounter and later wrote extensively about the experience. It was not combat as they understood it. The Americans fell on them like an avalanche, striking and disappearing before they could respond. Formation leaders called for them to maintain discipline, but there was no defense against such tactics. They twisted and turned, trying desperately to bring their guns to bear, but the enemy was always above them, always faster, always out of reach. Ito watched 6 of their aircraft destroyed without ever seeing an American fighter in his gun sight. It was not battle, it was execution. The engagement over Wewak marked a fundamental turning point in the air war over New Guinea. Japanese pilots, who had entered the war with absolute confidence in their tactical superiority, now faced the reality that their aircraft and tactics were becoming obsolete. The Ki-43, which had dominated Asian skies for 3 years, was helpless against the P-47's energy tactics. More devastating than the mechanical disadvantage was the psychological impact. Japanese pilot training emphasized spirit, skill, and warrior tradition dating back to the samurai. The P-47's tactics removed skill from the equation entirely, replacing it with physics and firepower. Captain Tomoyuki Yoshida, intelligence officer for the 4th Air Army, compiled loss statistics that revealed the catastrophic shift in combat effectiveness. In the 3 months before P-47 fighters arrived in theatre, Ki-43 units had maintained a 3-to-1 kill ratio against Allied fighters. In the 3 months after P-47 fighters became operational, that ratio reversed to 1-to-4 against the Japanese. By December 1943, it had deteriorated to 1-to-6. These weren't just statistics. They represented the systematic destruction of Japan's most experienced pilots. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures with increasing desperation. They tried stationing fighters at 25,000 feet to intercept P-47 fighters before they could dive. But the Ki-43's poor high-altitude performance meant they were sitting ducks for P-47 aircraft that could fight effectively at 35,000 feet. They tried concentrated defensive formations, but the P-47's 8-gun armament could scatter such formations with a single pass. They even attempted to lure P-47 fighters into low-altitude combat using decoy aircraft. But American pilots maintained rigid discipline, refusing to abandon their altitude advantage for any reason. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a Ki-43 pilot who survived 73 combat missions, later reflected with remarkable honesty. They had been taught that the superior pilot would always prevail, that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The P-47 proved this was fantasy. It didn't matter how skilled you were if the enemy attacked from an altitude you couldn't reach, at a speed you couldn't match, with firepower that destroyed you instantly. They were samurai trying to fight machines, and machines don't care about honor or tradition. Technical analysis revealed the depth of the Japanese disadvantage in stark mathematical terms. The Ki-43's maximum speed at 15,000 feet was approximately 320 miles per hour. The P-47 could maintain 380 miles per hour at the same altitude and could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive. The Ki-43's 2 machine guns fired a combined 18 rounds per second with limited armor-piercing capability. The P-47's 8 guns fired 100 rounds per second, each bullet capable of penetrating armor plate. The Ki-43 required precise shooting to damage enemy aircraft. The P-47's volume of fire meant that even moderate accuracy produced devastating results. But beyond the technical specifications, the P-47 represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy that the Japanese military establishment struggled to comprehend. Japanese aircraft were artisan products, each one carefully assembled by skilled workers. Their pilots trained for years to achieve aerial mastery. The P-47 was mass production incarnate. Republic Aviation was producing 15 aircraft per day by late 1943. Pilots received 300 hours of flight training before deployment, adequate but not exceptional. The American approach accepted that individual pilots and aircraft would be lost, but the system would prevail through overwhelming numerical and material superiority. This reality became crushing for Japanese pilots as 1943 turned to 1944. Every Ki-43 lost represented years of training and experience that couldn't be replaced. Every P-47 lost was replaced within weeks by an improved model with a freshly trained pilot. The Americans could afford to trade 1 for 1, even 1 for 2. The Japanese couldn't afford to trade at any ratio. The mathematics of attrition warfare were inexorable and unforgiving. By January 1944, the mere sight of P-47 formations caused Japanese formations to scatter and flee. Radio intercepts revealed the depth of demoralization among Japanese pilots. Thunderbolts high above became a call that triggered immediate evasive action, often aborting entire missions before contact was made. Japanese bomber operations over New Guinea virtually ceased because Ki-43 escorts couldn't protect them from P-47 attacks. Ground support missions became suicide runs as P-47 fighters established standing patrols over Japanese airfields. The 348th Fighter Group's spectacular success inspired rapid tactical evolution across the Southwest Pacific. The 35th Fighter Group converted from P-39 aircraft to P-47 fighters in November 1943 and immediately adopted Kirby's boom and zoom tactics. The 49th Fighter Group received P-47 aircraft in December and replicated the approach. Within 6 months, P-47 groups had established complete air superiority over New Guinea, enabling MacArthur's island-hopping campaign to accelerate dramatically beyond planned schedules. Individual pilot accounts revealed the complete transformation in combat dynamics. First Lieutenant Robert Aschenbrenner, who had previously flown P-39 aircraft against Ki-43 fighters with limited success and considerable terror, described his first combat in a P-47. It was like transitioning from a knife fight to commanding artillery. In the P-39, every engagement with a Ki-43 was life or death, desperately trying to get a shot while avoiding their guns. In the P-47, they were untouchable. They would spot Japanese fighters from 10,000 feet above, roll in, fire one burst, and zoom away. The enemy couldn't touch them. It wasn't even combat, it was execution. Aschenbrenner felt sorry for them, honestly. The Japanese response revealed growing desperation and recognition of their deteriorating position. The 14th Sentai received new Ki-84 Hayate fighters in March 1944, aircraft specifically designed to counter the P-47's advantages with improved speed and altitude performance. But there were too few Ki-84 aircraft, arriving too late, flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots. The massive industrial disparity meant that for every advanced Japanese fighter produced, America was producing 20 P-47 aircraft. Major Taruhiko Kobayashi, one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots with 30 confirmed victories, was shot down by P-47 fighters on April 19, 1944. Rescued after parachuting into the jungle and returned to duty, he reported with remarkable candor that the enemy they faced now was not the one they had defeated in 1942. The Americans had learned to use their material advantages while systematically denying Japanese pilots the close combat where their skills mattered. The P-47 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a weapons system designed to destroy them at ranges where they couldn't respond. They had no effective counter. It was like fighting men armed with rifles while carrying swords. The mathematics of aerial combat had indeed changed fundamentally, but not in the way Japanese pilots had expected. Where they had calculated turning radius and rate of climb as determining factors, P-47 pilots calculated energy management and firepower density. Where Japanese pilots sought the perfect deflection shot with limited ammunition, P-47 pilots saturated target areas with overwhelming firepower. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized individual warrior spirit and personal honor, American doctrine emphasized systematic efficiency through superior technology and tactics. By mid-1944, the transformation was complete and irreversible. The Ki-43 units that had swept Allied air forces from Asian skies in 1942 were reduced to hit-and-run tactics, avoiding combat whenever possible. Some Japanese units were recording 50% aircraft losses per month, unsustainable attrition that couldn't be replaced. Meanwhile, P-47 groups were expanding, with new aircraft arriving weekly, each one incrementally improved based on combat experience. The P-47D models arriving in mid-1944 featured bubble canopies for improved visibility, paddle blade propellers for better climb performance, and increased ammunition capacity. The P-47's success extended far beyond direct combat statistics. The aircraft's ability to carry 2,500 pounds of bombs made it a devastating ground attack platform. Japanese supply lines, previously protected by fighter cover and distance, became death traps. P-47 fighters would sweep ahead of advancing American ground forces, destroying Japanese artillery positions, supply dumps, and vehicle convoys with impunity. The psychological impact on Japanese ground forces was severe. The distinctive sound of P-47 engines triggered immediate dispersal to avoid strafing runs. Captain Kazuo Sato, staff officer with the 18th Army, described the impact in his post-war memoir. The Thunderbolts made daylight movement impossible. They had to move supplies at night in small groups, constantly watching the sky. Even then, P-47 fighters would catch them with parachute flares and attack in darkness. Japanese soldiers called them death from above because there was no defense, no warning. They controlled not just the air but everything beneath it. A single P-47 could paralyze an entire regiment. Neil Kirby's death on March 5, 1944, ironically demonstrated both the P-47's strengths and the critical importance of maintaining tactical discipline. Leading a 3-plane patrol over Wewak, Kirby had successfully bounced a formation of Ki-43 fighters, shooting down his 22nd victory. But instead of immediately zooming back to altitude as doctrine demanded, he turned to confirm the kill, bleeding off precious speed in the process. 3 Ki-43 fighters from the 77th Sentai caught him at low altitude and low speed, where their maneuverability advantage suddenly mattered again. Even then, it took concentrated fire from all 3 aircraft to bring down the P-47. Kirby managed to bail out, but was killed by gunfire while descending in his parachute, a violation of the informal rules of aerial combat that shocked even Japanese pilots. His death served as a stark reminder to P-47 pilots that if they abandoned the tactics that made the aircraft dominant, even the mighty Thunderbolt became vulnerable. The incident reinforced tactical discipline among American pilots who recognized that the P-47's advantages disappeared completely if they tried to dogfight like their opponents. The loss of Kirby, who had virtually created the tactics that made the P-47 successful, was deeply felt throughout the 5th Air Force. Major Tommy Maguire, who would become the second highest-scoring American ace with 38 victories, transitioned from P-38 aircraft to P-47 fighters in late 1944. He initially resisted, preferring the Lightning's twin-engine reliability. After his first combat mission in a P-47, he changed his mind completely. The Jug was like flying a battleship. You didn't dance with it. You hammered with it. The Zeros and Oscars couldn't touch you if you maintained discipline. The moment you tried to turn with them, you were dead. But if you kept your speed up and your altitude advantage, you were invincible. It wasn't about flying skill. It was about tactical discipline. The psychological transformation among Japanese pilots was complete by early 1945. Veterans who had entered the war as hunters now thought only of survival. New pilots, rushed through abbreviated training programs with as little as 50 hours of flight time, were often shot down on their first missions. The Ki-43, which had symbolized Japanese air superiority, became known as the flying coffin among its pilots. Morale collapsed as pilots realized they were being sent up as sacrifices to delay the inevitable American advance. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Ozawa, transferred from Navy Zeros to Army Ki-43 aircraft due to pilot shortages, described the hopelessness. Flying against P-47 fighters was not combat. It was survival. Their tactics consisted entirely of avoiding them. If they saw P-47 fighters above them, they fled. If Americans dove on them, they scattered and prayed. The few times they tried to fight back, they were slaughtered. The aircraft they had called inferior had become their executioner. The P-47's impact extended beyond its combat record to influence the entire strategic situation in the Pacific. The aircraft proved that American industrial methods could produce weapon systems that overwhelmed traditional military virtues. Courage, skill, and determination meant little against overwhelming firepower, superior altitude performance, and tactics that negated enemy advantages. The P-47 wasn't just defeating Japanese aircraft. It was defeating Japanese military philosophy that had dominated Asian warfare for decades. This transformation was reflected in pilot training programs on both sides. Japanese training in 1941 emphasized aerobatics, formation flying, and marksmanship. Individual pilots spent years perfecting their skills, becoming artists of aerial combat. By 1944, American training emphasized energy management, tactical discipline, and systems operation. Pilots needed only to be competent because the P-47's advantages and proven tactics would ensure victory. The aircraft and its doctrine, not individual brilliance, would win the war. The final insult to Japanese fighter doctrine came with the P-47N, introduced in early 1945. This variant, specifically designed for long-range operations in the Pacific, could fly 2,000-mile missions with external tanks. Japanese homeland defense fighters, expecting to engage B-29 bombers, found themselves facing P-47N escorts that could fight effectively at 35,000 feet, altitudes where even the best Japanese fighters struggled to operate. Ki-43 aircraft were completely helpless against these high-altitude intruders. On April 7, 1945, P-47N fighters from the 318th Fighter Group intercepted Japanese aircraft attempting to support the battleship Yamato's suicide mission to Okinawa. In a one-sided massacre lasting less than 15 minutes, P-47 fighters destroyed 18 Japanese aircraft without loss. The Ki-43 fighters in the escort force never even reached firing position before being shot down. It was symbolic of how completely the tables had turned since 1942. The industrial mathematics behind the P-47's dominance were staggering and decisive. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47 aircraft during the war, more than all Japanese fighter types combined. Each P-47 required 30,000 man-hours to produce. Japanese aircraft required nearly 50,000 due to less efficient production methods. The American pilot training program was producing 30,000 pilots annually by 1944. Japan managed fewer than 2,000 and of decreasing quality as experienced instructors were pulled into combat. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns could fire 3,400 rounds, enough ammunition for nearly 35 seconds of continuous fire. The Ki-43's 2 guns carried enough ammunition for less than 15 seconds of fire. In a single engagement, a P-47 could deliver more destructive power than a Ki-43 could in 3 complete missions. This firepower disparity meant that even glancing hits from a P-47 were often fatal to Japanese aircraft, while Ki-43 fighters needed sustained, accurate fire to damage the robust American fighter. The resilience of the P-47 became legendary among both American and Japanese pilots. The aircraft's air-cooled radial engine could absorb tremendous damage and continue operating. The pilot was protected by armor plate, bulletproof glass, and the massive engine acting as a shield. Numerous P-47 aircraft returned to base with cylinder heads shot off, oil lines severed, and hundreds of bullet holes in wings and fuselage. In contrast, the Ki-43's lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that even rifle-caliber hits could prove fatal. American pilots reported seeing Ki-43 fighters explode from single 50-caliber bullet impacts on fuel tanks. The Japanese philosophy of saving weight by eliminating protection had made sense when facing equally vulnerable Chinese aircraft in 1937. Against the P-47's overwhelming firepower, it was suicidal. The P-47 also revolutionized naval aviation support in the Pacific. While primarily a land-based aircraft, P-47N fighters with increased range began operating from captured island bases to provide cover for Navy operations. Their ability to engage Japanese aircraft at extreme range meant carrier task forces could operate with additional protection beyond their own fighter screens. Japanese kamikaze attacks, which relied on overwhelming carrier defenses through mass attacks, found themselves intercepted by P-47 fighters 50 miles from their targets. On May 25, 1945, the 318th Fighter Group, flying long-range P-47N aircraft from Aeshima off Okinawa, intercepted a massive kamikaze formation headed for the American fleet. In what became known as one of the most one-sided air battles of the Pacific War, P-47 fighters destroyed 34 Japanese aircraft in less than 20 minutes without losing a single fighter. Most of the Japanese pilots never even saw the American fleet they were supposed to attack. The Ki-43 and older aircraft comprising most of the kamikaze force were helpless against P-47 fighters attacking from above with devastating firepower. Lieutenant Yoshio Fukui, one of the few surviving Ki-43 pilots from the Philippines campaign, was reassigned to Homeland Defense in 1945. He later wrote with remarkable honesty that when he first flew the Ki-43 in 1941, they were invincible. By 1945, flying the same aircraft felt like a death sentence. The Americans had evolved while they had stagnated. The P-47, which they had mocked as a flying tank, had become their nightmare. It could appear at any altitude, any time, and destroy them before they knew it was there. Statistical analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey revealed the totality of Japanese defeat in fighter combat. By war's end, Japan had lost approximately 38,000 aircraft of all types, with 60% destroyed in aerial combat. The majority of these losses came in the war's final 2 years, when P-47 fighters and other advanced American fighters achieved overwhelming superiority. The Ki-43, which had accounted for more Allied aircraft destroyed than any other Japanese fighter in 1942, ended the war with pilots being instructed to avoid combat with American fighters at all costs. Post-war analysis revealed the completeness of the American victory. By August 1945, the United States had 2,000 operational P-47 aircraft in the Pacific Theater. Japan had fewer than 100 operational Ki-43 fighters, most flown by pilots with less than 100 hours of flight time. American pilots were rotating home after completing tours. Japanese pilots flew until they died. American units were receiving the latest P-47N models with improved everything. Japanese units were cannibalizing wrecked aircraft to keep anything flying. The final combat between P-47 and Ki-43 fighters occurred on August 14, 1945, one day before Japan's surrender. 4 P-47N aircraft from the 507th Fighter Group encountered 6 Ki-43 fighters over Tokyo Bay. In a brief engagement lasting less than 2 minutes, 3 Ki-43 aircraft were destroyed without damage to any American fighters. It was a fitting end to a completely one-sided relationship. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had mocked as a flying tank had systematically destroyed their air forces. Surviving Japanese pilots were remarkably candid in their post-war assessments. Colonel Ichiro Yamaguchi, who had commanded Ki-43 units from 1942 to 1945, testified to American interrogators that they entered the war believing their superior pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability would ensure victory. The P-47 taught them that wars are won by superior systems, not superior individuals. It didn't matter that their pilots were brave or skilled. The Americans had built an aircraft and developed tactics that made their advantages irrelevant. They turned aerial combat into an industrial process, and Japan had no answer. The technological gulf was equally stark. Post-war testing of captured Ki-43 aircraft by American pilots revealed an aircraft that would have been competitive in 1940, but was completely obsolete by 1943 standards. Test pilot Major James Matthews flew a captured Ki-43-2 and reported it was delightful to fly, light on the controls, incredibly maneuverable. In a 1930s-style dogfight, it would be formidable. But combat stopped being about tight turns and aerobatics when aircraft started carrying heavy armour and fighting at 400 miles per hour. The Ki-43 was perfectly designed for the wrong war. Conversely, Japanese test pilots who flew captured P-47 aircraft were amazed by the aircraft's capabilities. Captain Yoshio Hirose, who had flown Ki-43 fighters in combat, tested a P-47D in 1946. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The controls were heavy but precise. The armament was devastating. They fired at ground targets and they simply disappeared. He understood immediately why they had lost. This wasn't an aircraft. It was a weapons platform. Everything about it was designed to destroy enemies from positions of advantage. Veterans of both sides drew profoundly different lessons from their experience. American pilots learned that technology and tactics could provide overwhelming advantages if properly employed. The P-47 taught them that discipline and adherence to proven methods mattered more than individual heroics. Japanese pilots learned that courage without capability was meaningless, that industrial power determined military outcomes, and that their nation's military traditions had led them to disaster. Major Richard Bong, America's top-scoring ace with 40 victories, flew P-38 aircraft but trained with P-47 units and understood their impact. The Thunderbolt changed everything in the Pacific. Before it arrived, they were trading punches with the Japanese, winning some, losing some. After it arrived, it was no contest. The Japanese couldn't compete with that combination of firepower, speed, and altitude performance. Pilots who couldn't have survived in P-40 fighters became aces in P-47 aircraft. It wasn't about pilot skill anymore, it was about having the better system. Lieutenant Takeshi Maeda, who flew Ki-43 fighters from 1942 to 1945 and survived with 4 victories, reflected decades later. They started the war as samurai of the sky. They ended it as targets. The P-47 was everything they were not: heavy, powerful, brutally effective. It represented American thinking perfectly. Why turn with an enemy when you can destroy him from where he cannot reach you? Why rely on pilot skill when you can rely on overwhelming firepower? They fought with their heads. We fought with our hearts. Hearts lose to mathematics. General George Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, provided the epitaph for Japanese fighter aviation. The Japanese built beautiful aircraft like the Ki-43, perfectly suited for the war they wanted to fight. We built the P-47, perfectly suited for the war that actually existed. They wanted aerial duels between warriors. We gave them industrial annihilation. The P-47 didn't just defeat Japanese aircraft, it defeated Japanese thinking about air warfare. The last flying Ki-43 in Japanese service was destroyed on the ground by naval gunfire on August 18, 1945, 3 days after Japan's surrender. The 15,683rd and final P-47 rolled off Republic's production line on December 31, 1945. One aircraft represented the end of an era, destroyed and defeated. The other represented the dawn of American air supremacy that would dominate the following decades. The statistics spoke with absolute finality. In the Pacific Theater, P-47 units claimed 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat while losing 197 of their own to all causes, including operational accidents and ground fire. Approximately 150 P-47 aircraft were lost in aerial combat, a 25-to-1 kill ratio that defied every pre-war prediction. The Ki-43, which had entered the war with expectations of maintaining Japan's aerial superiority, ended it with negative kill ratios against every major American fighter type introduced after 1943. The Japanese pilots, who had dismissed the P-47 as an impossibly heavy, clumsy fighter, had learned through bitter experience that weight meant diving speed, that size meant durability, and that 8 guns meant certain death. Their beautiful, agile Ki-43 fighters, perfect for the gentlemanly aerial duels they had imagined, were swept from the sky by an aircraft designed for overwhelming force. The laughter had stopped at 400 miles per hour, 8 guns firing, falling from 30,000 feet like an avalanche of industrial might that buried everything beneath it.